Okay.
There we go. Now we're live.
There we go. Okay. See, man, you've got this down. You've clearly been in a few of these.
So highlight of this school year, I'm going to go with two things. One is I think the resiliency of the staff and the ability to finish the year strong in person with graduations that were in person. Big change from last year. But I think today just really exemplifies the district's drive to include the community. Tara and I both attended the interview process for the director position for diversity, inclusion. Sorry, I think there's another word, but I didn't memorize the title. And just that process was really impressive, how it was organized, how it was facilitated, and the amount of time that was given to just parents and community members to be a part of that process. And it just goes to show that the district really does spend time and energy on outreach and that they walk the talk. So I think that was a big win.
Okay, and now, of course, I apologize. My entire orientation has shifted. So with that, Jamie, you're up next. Highlight of the year. And let's do like a quick, like if you can keep it just a smidge snappy, because we do have some good content to get through tonight.
I would say for my son, literacy has always been a challenge, and this was really an amazing year for progress for him in the literacy space. And having read 7 of the 10 books on the Battle of the Books list was pretty amazing.
Great. Okay, next up, Lisa. Carol.
I would say I had a student that had horrible attendance problems and was lower on the reading scale, and his mom worked really hard to get him to school almost every day, and he really grew in reading. So that was a big celebration. It was exciting.
Yay! Great for those wins. All right, Lori, you're up next.
So I'm just going to go down the personal route. I guess the highlight of my year was how well my family came through this whole together. We're all healthy. We all kept plugging it away at our goals, and we did great. So that's my highlight. And we get along great still.
Right? All right, Dave, you're up next.
I'd have to say when we got all the students back at least 4 days a week and the teachers back, you know, the vast majority 4 days a week, it was nice to return to in-person, even though that was a very different in-person than a typical year.
Great. All right, Tara.
So I would say kind of in the work realm, I was impressed with the creativity teachers, educators showed, not just in District 2, but it was a shift. It happened quick and changed every day. So for those that endured and committed and the work that I do sort of during the day, just impressed with people's commitment and creativity, patience to find different methods, strategies, tactics, like to do culture, climate, equity work, as well as just teaching content, like just that. So I think both of those things, I think were really highlights. People really dug in and provided grace all around. I thought was a big deal.
Thank you. Mackenzie.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes. Oh, and you're outside. How lovely.
It's pretty nice out here. This is the highlight. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, so I'll go to work a little bit, but I work in digital learning and curriculum development in my day job. And I think seeing the acknowledgement in a big picture scale from schools and others that digital learning has a place in schools, and really acknowledging the value of digital learning and how accessible it is to all students was a bit, I've known it for a decade, but to see that come to the forefront of learning was really exciting for me, and pretty good job stability for me. So now that we know.
Thank you. Vanessa.
Definitely basketball season was the highlight. Basketball season's in the winter time anyway, and so it's kind of a time where you don't get out and do much. But just being able to get together with the guys and have something normal for them to do. They just were super fun to be around. I enjoyed every minute. We had a really fun season. So activities and sports, the things that the kids do that are normal, were just so critical, I think. So that was cool.
Agreed. Thank you. Stephanie Ade.
Hi, my celebration is I joined a new staff this year, and I've just been so impressed about how they have come together and collaborated and worked so hard with so much joy, and just to see how much students have not only grown, but they really are thriving. I'm just proud of everything that they've accomplished, and it brings me a lot of joy. I just got off of a Zoom right now of students sharing out state reports via their remote classrooms, and it was just fun to celebrate with them just a few moments ago.
A very immediate thank you. Michelle.
My highlight would be I got a chance to experience all different types of schooling for my children this year, whether it be remote or hybrid or full-time. And I'm now very confident that full-time is what works best for my children. And so, I didn't know that before, and now I do. Something learned.
Great, thank you. Stephanie Ortiz.
Hi, sorry. My youngest is actually about to give his state report in about 2 more kids. So I'm kind of half here, half there. It's fine. I've heard him practice. So just general celebration, is that anything? Okay.
Yes.
So my 2 of my 3 kids stayed remote the whole time. My eldest, being in middle school, kind of required me to not be too far away to kind of listen and be a safety net for him, which is not something I would want to do normally because he needs to fail, but whatever. But I've listened to a ton of 7th grade teachers, and I tell you, I've heard some really amazing ones. He's at Rocky Top, but I've heard a couple that I just think are amazing. And it's nice to, although it's probably weird that they have random people listening in on them, and I can't imagine how that feels, but I've just heard some really amazing teachers, and then talking to friends in 2 different districts who are teachers, just Adams 12 is doing well in compared to some other districts, and I've got a couple teacher friends who are jealous of some of the decisions and the way we do things. So it's just nice to hear it from the other side.
Great, thank you. And for Josh and Jessica, we're doing highlights of the year. So I'm going to give you a moment. Josh, I think you've probably picked up, so you're up next. Josh, are you available to unmute?
Yeah, sorry, I just hit the wrong button, was all.
Ah, yes.
So highlight for the year was not having to drive downtown every single day. It saved a lot of time, did a lot of making of things a little bit better as far as, balancing everything out. But I mean, there were a lot of good things that were accomplished this year, and I'm happy to see a lot of things happening in places where we wouldn't have necessarily looked at it before if we hadn't had the other, even though it's not great. We've learned a lot about a lot of different things, and a lot of companies and a lot of businesses have made a lot of decisions based on really getting all of that stuff to benefit their employees and their customers, and moving forward, hopefully we'll see some of that continue.
Great, and thank you. Jessica, I know I'm putting you on the spot a smidge.
No, you're good. I'm having, my computer had died, so I'm sorry I'm late. It's having technical difficulties as it tries to power back on to 2%. But highlight of the year, I would say for me, is I actually started a new job back in January as an instructional designer, and I just love being creative on a daily basis. So I would say it's kind of a everyday highlight, I guess.
That's great. Okay, and it doesn't look like we've had anybody else join us. And I would say my highlight of the year is actually the work of the DAC. I just have been unbelievably impressed with how folks have stepped up and stepped into roles where we're asking for help and input. I think moving sort of the vision forward that we started last spring, and who could have predicted that things would go into, you know, basic shutdown at the time we were really, I think, hitting this incredible inflection point. But I've said it personally and I've said it professionally about how I feel the work of this group and the people here have really been the highlight of my year. So thank you. All right, Jack, I think we're ready to head into our formal agenda items.
So we have two tonight. One is a quick summary of the board presentations last week, and then we will hand it over to Dave to kick off the UIP work for the coming school year. So Aaron, I'll go first. We did present two different projects last week. I talked through the UIP simplification. I believe most of you, if not all of you, saw the draft when I was gone. But it was basically 6 areas of focus that we wanted to integrate into the UIP work starting this year and into the future years as appropriate. The main area of focus was going to be questions and solution simplification around the UIP process in general. And so our intention tonight is to integrate that so that a year from now, we can report to the board about the progress around the process of the UIP itself. There were a lot of questions that came up. 2 pieces of low-hanging fruit is just access and communication of the UIP's existence that we feel we can just handle through communication, social media, email, that sort of thing as a result of this year's UIP. I think my favorite part of the presentation is that I thought we would have to come back and get a formal response from the board in a month or 2. And we got thumbs up on the spot from all board members that we could proceed. So thank you, Lori and Jamie, for that. That was very much appreciated. So I think that's enough said. I was really pleased to test out our work model, our work memo, our summary of work on these projects so that we can put that into gear for the rest of our work in the coming school year. Aaron, do you want to talk through the school accountability?
Well, I would hope that all of you are fairly well versed with some of the work results of that survey. Jumping headphones. Again, shared the results of our survey, received some positive feedback, and again, some nice next steps in determining direction for the recommendations. The first of which is really how we go about setting a vision for the staff work in the district that both district staff and the DAC can anchor into. So again, very encouraging. I I think all of you have access to that information. And then I guess at this point, I would just invite Lori and Jamie, if there was any other comment or reflections from the board presentation.
I just want to reiterate and tell the rest of you that weren't necessarily at the board meeting. I'm really impressed with the work of this group this year and setting forth the charges that we gave you back in the fall. You really took the initiative to go down the road. You know, one of it was not quite a traditional path to take on the DAC, but given the circumstances of this year, I thought it, you know, we all agreed it was a good path to follow, and we learned a lot of, we got a lot of useful information because of your work. And I just want to say thank you to each of you for the contributions that you all made.
Thank you. All right. And Jamie, if I recall, you were not able to be at that meeting, is that correct? So thank you. Lori, for sort of summarizing that, much appreciated. And with that, are we ready to dive into our content work for the evening? All right, and with that, conversation up.
I'm sorry, Erin, you cut out there. What did you say?
You're on.
Okay.
I will turn off my video because it has been intermittent all day. So apologies, folks. I'm just going to stop my video and hopefully that'll help.
Okay. Well, thank you. I wanted to, in talking to Jack and Erin, wanted to introduce to you some of the work we've been doing on the UIP thus far amongst staff. Some of this information has been shared with principals as well, obviously, folks all across learning services, and wanted to get some feedback from you as we go through this. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. I'll be presenting a presentation I've modified slightly. I shared this with the learning services staff to talk about what we've learned sort of as we've gone through and think about how we want to adjust our UIP next year. Talk a little bit about the process and then start getting into what we've already done and kind of what data we have. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Is everybody seeing that?
Yes.
Okay, great. So just wanted to, again, we're going to be talking a little bit about the DAC and our Unified Improvement Plan update here. Ultimately, what we'd like to do, I'd like to accomplish tonight is to help everyone understand the new context for developing the district UIP. There have been some changes that we need to look at. Then I want to review some data that we've learned since March of 2020, because even though that's a fairly long time frame, we don't have much. Then I want to review the aspects of the existing UIP, what we developed last school year that covered both last year and this year, and then review suggestions and feedback from learning services that we've already gotten, also some from principals as well to a certain degree on some of this. And I'm very interested in getting your impact or your feedback about what we're thinking about. None of this is final by any means, so we're in the kind of beginning stages. Now, the way I'd like to couch this is, and Jack and Erin thought this would be a good way to go, is to consider two questions as we're working through this presentation. So if you keep these questions in mind, and as other questions pop into your head, we're happy to address those too. I have periodic stopping points during the presentation to address questions, but I want you to think about what questions do you have about the process in terms of the UIP and what we'll be doing? And then secondly, what content that we're going to discuss here do you want to learn more about? And this will hopefully guide our work in terms of DAC and potentially the whole DAC group, as well as the DAC UIP subcommittee. So please keep these in mind. Erin, I believe, created a Jamboard. I don't know if you want to share that with people or if we can just kind of capture things as we go along. Thoughts about that, Erin?
There isn't, whatever, Erin, there isn't a chat to send us to the Jamboard, right? So like, unless there's some other way. You all may have access to the chat.
Thank you. I was
Oh,
noticing we have, I don't know if this
So-
is like a Zoom upgrade. I'm not quite sure. Jack, what I might do, if you're willing, I will send you the Jamboard link and maybe we could email it out to the distribution. Might be the easiest way.
Sure, I can do that.
Okay.
Okay.
Give me
So-
2 shakes, folks. Look to your email for a Jamboard link. And as they referenced, like, there's the immediate use, but then again, to inform sort of our UIP efforts moving forward. So please capture your questions. Again, super basic, but just allows us sort of a record and something to look back to, because, you know, last meeting of the year, we all might be a little crispy. So want to come back to this. Thank you.
Okay, so as we go along, knowing that the Jamboard is going to be more of an independent activity for you, feel free to jump in as you have questions. I did leave a couple spaces after the initial sections for questions and then one toward the end, but feel free to jump in as we go. So what I want to do is dive into what we've learned to a degree in terms of the data that we have now, because last year we didn't get any spring assessment data. There were no state assessments. And so really we're kind of left with the data that we have from our own interim assessments and some data from the state. So the first data I'm going to show you is looking at fall to fall growth, fall of 2019 to this fall on our NWEA MAP assessment. It's an interim assessment that students take in reading and math. And I will walk you through all of this as much as possible. I'm going to try and define every acronym as we go. But if I miss anything, please let me know. So this first set of data shows what happened from fall of 2019 to fall of 2020 in terms of reading growth from grades 2 through 9. What we'll say here is the first caveat I'll mention about these data is that the growth we're looking at is what's called a median growth percentile. And the benchmark typically that we would look at for being satisfactory is the 50th percentile, meaning that would be average growth, students making average growth. The one caveat we want to make sure we know is that that growth estimate is being compared to kiddos who were not experiencing a pandemic from the norm year. So the data for our students during the pandemic is being compared to students that did not have a pandemic. So naturally, we'd expect slightly lower growth, just given the nature of what we were dealing with. What you see here are those median growth percentiles broken up into 4 colors, 1 to 39 being red, 40 to 49 being yellow, slightly below average, green is a little average to above average, and blue is well above average. When we look at reading, what you'll see is there was one grade level that was significantly below average, second grade, 2 grades, third and ninth, that were above average, just slightly. And then grades 4 through 8, we see were slightly below average. If you were to ask me coming into this year, what I would expect, this would be something I would hope for other than what we're seeing in terms of second grade. Most grade levels were below average, but not significantly below average, a little below average. So reading, we're seeing not significantly below average growth from fall to fall. When we look at math, what you'll see is, and I don't know if you can see that, you might need to minimize your, what we're seeing in terms of the gallery, is you'll see math was a very different story. When we look at math, pretty much grades 2 through 7, we're seeing significantly below average growth from fall to fall, with 8th grade being below average and 9th grade being above average. So the data for math and reading were telling us a different story at that time in terms of what we could expect to see fall to fall. Now, moving forward, we also use this test in winter, so we can look at fall to winter growth. So we're talking about this fall to middle of the year. When we look at reading, slightly different orientation because I want to look at a couple of different metrics for you. And it's broken down by level. The reason I did that is because our participation in winter was not what it was in fall. Many schools chose not to give winter map because we were getting kids back in person at that time. So we need to take this data with a grain of salt. But what we see is at the elementary level, if you look over to the right-hand side, we saw the median conditional growth percentile decline significantly compared to last year. We did fall to winter last year. We saw it decline by 11 points in reading. And in middle school, we saw a decline of 6 points. If you look at the left side of the table, what you'll see is in terms of the tests scale, and a scale is just a metric to allow us to give us an idea of how high are students achieving. So for example, on the ACT, the scale is 1 to 36. On the SAT, it's 200 to 800. On MAP, it's about low 100s to upper 300s. The average gain an elementary student makes is about 7.5 points in 2019-20. And in 2021, it was a little more than half that. For middle school, it was on average 2.4 points. And again, it was about half that. The one thing I do want to point out about this, though, obviously we would love to see students making more growth, is you'll hear the term COVID loss or learning loss. What you're seeing here is there is less growth than previously, but there were no net losses where students were moving backwards. So we refer to this as not necessarily keeping the trajectory we want, but that students on average are still making growth. So you can see we saw some significant declines from fall winter last year in both the overall RIP point gain as well as growth percentiles. When I look at math, what you can see is again somewhat similar in terms of the scale score change. And then you can also see a drop here based on math. But it's interesting to note at both reading and math, the drops were more significant at elementary than they were at middle, which was another aspect we saw at mid-year. Now, at this point, before we leave map data, I'll see if there are any questions. We are hoping to have an analysis of the fall to spring data here soon. We've got some initial data, but I haven't been able to dig into it because we just got it. So before I leave the map data, are there any questions that people have in terms of the map data?
I do.
Shoot.
So I have two questions.
Mm-hmm.
So the number, like the total number of kids, are those numbers low?
Going back to the previous slide?
Like the total amount of kids, like the number of kids tested, are those lower than in years previous?
The fall to fall, no. Those are very similar to what they've been in the past because we require fall testing.
Okay.
We don't require mid-year testing. Most schools do mid-year testing typically, especially elementary schools.
Mm-hmm.
But there were a lot of folks who didn't this mid-year. That's why we're so interested in the fall to spring data, because normally we don't require spring, but we did require spring this year to get a better handle on these data. And as I have those, and as we continue this work, I'll be sharing that information with you. The preliminary information I have fall to spring is we're again seeing below average growth of what we would see from a typical year. So the pandemic year has resulted in lower growth rates, but it's been interesting to see that thus far, what I've looked at and what I've seen is at the elementary level, the lower elementary level is where we're seeing less growth than typical. And at the middle school level, we're seeing growth that's a little more typical. It's still below. So there's an impact that seems to be by age. And the data fall to spring also comes back to what we saw fall to fall. The reading growth was not as drastic a change below average. The math growth was universally 2 through 8 or 1 through 8, I should say, were a little more impacted. But again, I haven't had a chance to delve into those too much because the map window just closed.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
the values were lower, and that's why we need to take these with a grain of salt. I just wanted to share it because that's what we had at the time.
Yeah, I had a second question, and I always forget this. So if a student takes a MAPS test in the fall and it has that projected score, like goal for them, and then they take it in the winter, and let's say they do well, then so their score goes up. Does it bump their projected score up so that they have to do even higher in the fall? I mean, in the spring?
That's a great question. What happens is this: if you have to look at what growth term you're looking at. So for example, if I'm looking at fall to winter, the winter projection is based on how the student did in the fall and solely how they did in the fall. If I look at the fall to spring projection, again, it's based solely on how they did in the fall. So if they made a lot of growth in the winter, it doesn't change their fall to spring projection. It could change their winter to spring projection. Does that make sense? So when we talk about projections, that first term that's listed is always what that projection is based on. And that's based on how students in the national norm sample, when that was created, did when they started with that same score in that same term. Any other questions? Those are good questions. Thank you.
I've got one, Dave.
Yes.
I'm just curious because you said or indicated, and I apologize if I missed this, there's a lot of detail. In this winter assessment cycle, can you give an indication? We don't have the end counts here. Sort of how would you describe the representativeness of this data for the district as a whole? Is this like a smaller sample? I'm just curious, like, how indicative do you think it might be?
I wanted to be careful about how much density I put in the presentation. What I can tell you is the sample was significantly smaller. We had in some grade levels between 40 to 50% of the number of test takers, and in some grade levels even less. What I can tell you is at the elementary grades, the sample was more representative. If we don't look at number and we just look at composition of the sample, like the percentage of students who were free and reduced lunch, the percent of students of color, the percent of students who are English language learners, the percent of students who were students with IEPs, that matched more than the middle school level. And I didn't even include ninth grade because we only had 2 schools participate, and they were schools that were not typical for the district. So that was even more significantly off. And so when we're looking at these data, there's more confidence as it relates to the elementary school than middle school at this point. But again, I chose to put this in here to let you know that we did get data at winter. We did look at that data, but really we're kind of putting more eggs in the basket of the fall to spring data because it will be even more representative. When we look at the ends, we only lost we typically have about anywhere between 2,200 and 2,500 kids test per grade level. And our samples were, the biggest difference was about 400, but most grade levels were within 200 of the fall testing. So it's pretty representative in terms of spring.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Helpful
Good question.
context.
Dave, are you taking into account that those kids that were testing at home had parental interference?
That's one thing, one of the variables that we're going to look at, and obviously it's going to take us a while to do this. We're just doing kind of our typical analysis now that we can get out right away and get to teachers and principals before they leave for the summer. We have a way in our Infinite Campus, which is our student information system. We have data logged on whether a student is in person or hybrid, depending upon the time of the year, or we're fully remote. So we can disaggregate the data that way when we look at it to determine who took it remotely, first of all. And then, but the data is not totally clean either, because some families elect to bring their kids in to test, even though they were remote. So it's not going to be totally ideal, but there are anecdotal stories of parents being just off screen and helping kiddos. So that's, just a reality. So again, another little variable to try to account for. Any other questions before we move on to the next little bit of data? Okay, if we move on to now, we're looking at PALS. This is an assessment given to students K through 3 for the Colorado Read Act. So it's really looking at students' literacy. And so this is really a reading assessment, and that we give that to all students in K through 3 times a year. And really what we had really that's meaningful is the fall data. We'll have spring data again here soon, so we'll take that into account. But what we're looking at here is the percentage of students that scored below a specific cut point, indicating they likely have a significant reading deficiency. This isn't a grade level mark where students are on grade level or average reading. They're at a lower standpoint. The SRD cut point is what we call it, is a fairly low level of reading, and it indicates that students very likely need a lot of intervention to be successful as they move through school. And so what you're seeing here is for the district by grade level, as well as all grade levels combined, that lowest row is the percentage of students who scored below that cut point from 16-17 all the way to this year, 2020-21. Not surprisingly, when we got to fall, based on what we just saw, we saw an increase at every grade level in the percentage of students scoring below that cut point. Overall, for all students K3, it was 6.6%. And you can see how that breaks down for the different grade levels. The largest grade increase was at third grade, where we had a 10.5% increase over last year, 2019-20. And again, those 2019-20 data were pre-pandemic, because this is fall scores. So we're again seeing an impact on reading here in terms of the achievement of students, particularly those at that lower level of achievement. Question on the PALS scores. Again, we'll look at this when we get spring data to get a feel for where things are and how much things have changed since fall to this spring.
Dave, I have a question. Did I hear correctly that the 2021 was pre-pandemic? Because
if I said that, no, 2019-20 is pre-pandemic. This year is during the pandemic.
Mid-pandemic. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yep, you're welcome. And if I did say that, I misspoke. The 19-20 column is pre-pandemic. The 2021 column is during the pandemic. Now, not all the data were necessarily bad. PWR, it stands for post-secondary workforce readiness. So these are metrics that we look at in terms of high school and how are we doing. Really, it's a K-12 system, but most frequently it's the high schools that push these data at the end. But we know graduation rate and other things really start in kindergarten, that we're preparing kids for graduation now who just started kindergarten. But PWR stands for post-secondary and workforce readiness. And there's a couple of data sources that we get from the state each year that are measured regardless of the pandemic or not. The first is four-year graduation rate. And four-year graduation rate is when a student enrolls in 9th grade, they become part of a graduation cohort. And they have 4 years to graduate school to be on time in terms of their graduation. And that's what this 4-year graduation rate is. And what you see broken down here is for all schools as well as non-charter schools. We like to look at both because it's important. What you'll see as we go from 2016, that's the class of 2016. So those kids who graduated in May of 2016 all the way through May of 2020. We don't get our current graduates, the 2021 graduating class, until January. So this is going to be a little while. But the nice thing to see is for all schools, you've seen generally an increase as we move up. There's a slight decrease from 2018 and 19 and a little bit lower in 2020 than 2018. We had a new school join us that were part of our data, and that was New America Thornton. They're an alternative education campus, and they had an impact on our 4-year graduation rate. So when you look at the non-charter schools, what you'll see is we've seen an increase year over year from 2016 to 2020. So I want to give a lot of credit to the schools that were really focused to get kids across the line in terms of graduation in the middle of the pandemic in that 2020 school year. Obviously, we're very intrigued to see what our 2021 data are, because again, schools have been working just as hard, but in a truly pandemic and primarily remote environment, it'll be interesting to see. Anecdotally, we've heard there are significantly higher F rates, but we don't know that that's necessarily for seniors, or is that younger kids who are just entering high school or in 10th grade. So we're going to have to wait and see where those data land. Then in terms of dropout rate, this is a year-to-year calculation. So the graduation rate follows a cohort of kids for 4 years. Dropout is any student in grades 7 through 12 who left our school. A dropout is a student who leaves our district and does not enroll anywhere else in the state, or goes to an out-of-state school, a private school, any of those types of circumstances. And we know that when they leave, transcripts are requested, so forth. So what you'll see for our dropout rate is we actually saw a slight decline from 2019 to 2020, which I thought was really pretty interesting, when kids could have checked out at the end of the year, but we didn't see that. Again, we're waiting to see in terms of 2021 what those data look like. Again, you see a little bit of a spike in dropout rate from 2018 to 19 and 20. Again, there were a significant number of dropouts from that AEC we added who impacted these data. And when you look at non-charters, you see actually the 2019 and 2020 data are below where we were before then. Questions on the grad rate or the dropout rate? Yes, Jack.
If in 2020, a high school senior did not meet the requirements to graduate, so a year ago, would they have been deemed a dropout at that point, or would that impact the graduation rate?
It's a great question. If they stay enrolled, like if they were enrolled through the whole school year, they don't affect the dropout, and they do affect the grad rate. But what happens is CDE also calculates different grad rates. They calculate a 5-year grad rate, a 6-year grad rate, and a 7-year grad rate. So what would happen is if that student didn't graduate after 4 years, but then graduated the next year in 5 years, they would count as a graduate in the 5-year graduation rate. So we track these data over time, just because we want to keep kids who don't necessarily hit the finish line on the time we would typically expect. We want to keep them engaged because we know that high school diploma is incredibly important, whether that's from a traditional high school or at one of our alternative high schools. So we track those data. I hope that explained that situation.
Yes, thanks.
Any other questions on the PWR data? Now, I left a slide here for questions and discussion. That's really the bulk of the data we have. We're having to rely on, at least in terms of the outcome measures measured by our district performance framework that are typically what we include in the district UIP. It measures achievement, growth, and post-secondary and workforce readiness. So those are the data we really have this year in terms of those measures. So again, just want to mention, because we're going to talk about some different types of measures that we can look at as we think about the district UIP moving forward, and schools may also think about their school UIPs moving forward. But before we leave the data, any other questions about the data that we discussed, or any other questions you might have about data in general?
I have a question about data in general. There is a question on the Jamboard. I'm about to add another one. Not necessarily about the data that you presented. There is a question around when people opt out of state standardized testing. And I am curious if the district knows, or Dave, you know, of how many, what was the drop off? Do you know how many opted out of state standardized testing this year, particularly just this spring? You probably know for 2020, because there was none, because it didn't happen. So I am curious about the opt-out percentage, or if you have any of that for this spring.
Yeah, we have a very, I mean, it's a preliminary estimate, but it should be pretty close. We don't anticipate a huge number of changes. So if we go back to 2019, the last year we had state assessments. And in terms of CMAS, I don't know PSAT, SAT, that's all paper testing, and it's going to take a while to get those data back. But in terms of CMAS, grades 3 through 8, ELA and math, what we typically see in grades 3 through 6 really is about 1 to 2% of parent opt-out. So it's really pretty minimal generally in terms of parent opt-outs. In 7th and 8th grade, and it doesn't matter, the content areas are very similar. So it's not like we have a lot more ELA or a lot more math, they're similar. In terms of 7 and 8, it's up more in the 3 to 4% range. So again, not significant, but a little higher as you get into middle school. The preliminary data I have, and remember, the state said the required tests this year are 3, 5, 7 ELA and 4, 6, 8 math. So students didn't have to take both. There was an opt-in, and that's a whole nother question, and I don't have that data. So I know it's minimal. We didn't have a lot of opt-ins. But what we saw at the elementary level, whether it was ELA or math, what we saw was between, well, really 3rd through 6th was between 30 and 40% of parents opted their kids out in grades 3 through 6. And in grades 7 and 8, it was between 40 and 50% opted their kids out. The preliminary information I got from the state at an AC meeting, it's a geeky data person meeting and accountability meeting, so I'll leave it at that. The state was pretty similar in terms of having similar opt-out rates, about 30%.
Across the state. So other metro area districts had that. I mean, that is a lot in my thinking. I was not expecting those numbers. So, okay, but that is kind of that was sort of a typical across the state. That's very helpful and will be fascinating moving forward.
Yeah. I can't tell you about all the other metro districts. I can say we were similar to the state, and we know some metro districts may be different than us, or more or less, what have you, just because we all are dealing with unique communities and organizations that have different feelings about standardized assessment or not. But yeah, it's significant, and obviously there's quite a bit of wondering about how useful these data will be in a lot of different ways moving forward. So that's just something we're going to have to work on as we look at and take that with a grain of salt, for sure. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. It's so helpful.
Dave, what about adding 4th and 5th grade to PALS data for the students that are still on district literacy plans? Because we do PALS for them too, and it's required.
Well, there is testing required. It doesn't have to be PALS. It could be BRI. There are other assessments. Not every school chooses to do 4th and 5th grade PALS testing. And so that's why we didn't report it here typically, because that's not something that we require. That may be something that changes going forward, but that's kind of where we are with PALS in terms of 4th and 5th grade.
Ah, I see. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so I'm happy to address if questions arise, feel free to bring them up. That's what we've kind of learned, the limited information we've learned since really March of 2020. What I want to do now is reorient us back, and I know there are a number of folks here who served on the UIP subcommittee. Many of you did not, and so I'm going to take us back a little bit in terms of what our focuses were in terms of our district UIP that we established during that 2019-20 school year that will continue to roll out this year. So as we move, PPC stands for Priority Performance Challenge. So once we look at all our data in the UIP process, we look for things that we would consider the biggest challenges we are facing as a district. And the committee the UIP subcommittee, along with learning services, really came to these being our priority performance challenges. And again, you might want to minimize the gallery a little bit so you can see all of these. I'll give you a summary and then we can talk a little bit about them. The priority performance challenges we identified, in achievement, it was that our elementary and middle school English language arts data are increasing on CMAS, but they're not commensurate with our peer districts, meaning similar districts to us in free reduced lunch, similar demographics. They're going up, which is a good thing, the achievement rates, but they're not where they are with those peer districts. So that's why we wanted to maintain literacy as a focus and achievement. And then on 10th and 11th grade, the thing we noticed as we were developing this UIP was that there were some significant declines we were seeing at the high school level for PSAT and SAT data, that the evidence-based reading writing, and that's that acronym EBRW, were declining significantly over time. So this literacy issue, while things were going up at elementary and middle, they were going down at the high school level, and we wanted to address that because we hadn't seen that before. In terms of growth, at the elementary and middle school level, our growth rates were above that 50th percentile, which is a good thing. That means they were above average, but they were lagging where our math growth rates were. Traditionally in our district, our math growth rates are higher than our English language arts. And that's, again, another reason we've been focusing on English language arts. What we're seeing with PSAT, SAT in that evidence-based reading writing is those growth values were declining below the 50th percentile. So not only was achievement declining, growth was following with that. Also, specifically for students on free reduced lunch, that's FRLs, and students with an IEP, an individualized education plan, those growths have consistently been below the 50th percentile at all school levels. Those are obviously heavily impacted groups. And so we wanted to highlight that that's a challenge that we want to address, getting students that are more impacted financially, their background, as well as students with IEPs, getting those growth rates higher because we want those students to catch up. Lastly, in the post-secondary and workforce readiness area, we mentioned the significant declines in SAT, but it was both for English language arts, that EBRW, as well as math there. So those were the priority performance challenges we identified in our last UIP development. And those of you that were on that UIP subcommittee, hopefully those ring a bell. I know it's been a long time since we've looked at them. And so those are the challenges that we faced. And based on those challenges, we created some major improvement strategies. The first one was around literacy curriculum, refining that and enhancing our curriculum, units of study aligned to the standards, and in other content areas. So thinking about how do we do literacy across content areas. For elementary teachers, that's not as big a leap, but for secondary teachers, being a former chemistry teacher, oftentimes teachers in those content areas feel a little less prepared to teach literacy skills because that's not necessarily our background. So that was our focus to improve instructional practice to help with these literacy issues we were seeing. Then the other was working with special populations related to literacy. So integrating practices for students who are gifted and talented, even though they weren't a priority performance challenge, they're an awfully often under scrutinized group, shall we say, in terms of special education and English language learners to, again, support literacy outcomes. Those were the areas that our group decided to focus on moving forward. So these were the focuses. So questions on the priority performance challenges and the major improvement strategies, the MISs. Jack?
I was going to craft a question for the Jam board, but I think it's better to just ask it. When you say our group crafted these improvements, I already forgot what MIS is. Who is my group or our group? What does that group of people consist of?
It consists of multiple groups. It consists of all learning services staff. It concerns of consultations with school administrative staff. It also, I was sort of focusing it on our group here, the UIP subcommittee, because all of this went through the subcommittee for them to look at, weigh in on, and help make determinations about, are we on the right track based on what we are thinking in terms of learning services leadership and the administrative leadership at schools. So that's when I'm referring to our group. It was probably more inclusive than just one group, but really talking about the UIP subcommittee when I was making that reference.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, Tara?
So I did put it on the Jamboard, but this is just for me who's never been on the UIP group, just a general, like a quick, I assume the board approves the UIP. It does or doesn't necessarily go to the state. I don't know if it's a state requirement for the district. And then other questions just around the creation and timeline for a UIP. Clearly it's an annual process. And when it obviously gets approved, and then when, how, and you, I say you in the broadest way of you, review and look at the strategies that sort of, August to the 10 months of a school year, like that. Those are those basic UIP questions that I know the subcommittee knows, but I do not. And hopefully they're quick answers.
Sure, I'll give you the quick answers. And actually I'm glad you asked the question. So realistically, what happens? The board has to approve the district plan. The board also has to approve any priority improvement or turnaround plan. Those are the two lowest categories for schools. So they have to approve those. And whenever it's developed, we submit them to the state, and the state displays them on their website. They have a particular landing page you can go to find any UIP, be it a district or the state. Now, if your district, like for example, we are fully accredited, so we get what's called a biennial year of flexibility. So we didn't develop a UIP this year because we had that biennial year of flexibility that allowed us to use last year's with this year's as well. And the UIP, when it's developed, covers 2 years, 2 school years. Now, if you're below that level performance for schools, you have to develop a UIP annually that then gets submitted to the state. Now, in terms of the board has to approve the plan for the district and those priority improvement turnaround schools. The school executive directors, we have executive directors at each school level, 2 at elementary, 1 at middle, 1 at high. They review every school's UIP that's not approved by the board, and they review the one that's approved by the board. And then in terms of the district, the U is inclusive of pretty much everybody in learning services who is involved kind of doing parallel work with school staff and the district UIP subcommittee to develop this UIP. The reason I'm glad you asked that, the timeline is changing for the UIP development this coming year. It used to be due to the state on April 15th, which was always a little wonky because you're developing it, you put it in place, and then boom, it's spring, summer. So the timeline changes that there now need to be in place in October and submitted by October 15th of next year, which puts us in a bit of a crunch this year to develop it without a lot of compelling data. So we're looking at ways to do that, but it makes more sense logically because we have the UIP at the beginning of the year, we're monitoring it throughout the year and as we go. So what's also going on behind the scenes is the plan is in place. And because of the way we've done this work before, the UIP subcommittees wasn't as much place monitoring the plan during the year. Are we actually doing what we're saying we're doing? How successful are we with this? That's something that will change going forward. But learning services folks have always done that to say, look, we said in our major improvement strategy, we're going to have this professional development. Did we do it? Did it go well? How do we know it went well? Are we getting feedback from principals and teachers that it went well? Are we able to collect survey data about it? That type of thing. Does that help?
Yeah, I think the every 2 years is useful to know. I have my own opinion about short-term and long-term thinking and planning around strategies for schools. But knowing that we have that 2-year process. So it sounds to me that by October 15th of this year, 2021, in which we are in, that the 2022 UIP is due October 15th.
Mhm.
And that is technically a 2-year plan. Is that right? Just clarifying to make sure I understand that process, but it does help make more sense of it. So thank you for that.
No, it's a great question, and that's why we're really having this presentation in this setting to get people a little bit more level in terms of their understanding of the district's UIP and the UIP process, because obviously it's very important. And I think you've heard from the UIP subcommittee talk about how involved and intricate and dense this project can be, and so you're getting a little bit of a taste of it tonight is what we're going through. So thank you for your question. So if we move on, then these were the big questions that came up. So as I was meeting with our learning services team, these were the things we asked them. Should pre-pandemic data and efforts have more weight than pandemic effort and weight? And there can be cases made for both of those. So things that happen, the data that happened beforehand, or the data that happened during the pandemic. Should we focus solely on outcome data, or should non-academic data be factored in as well? Things like behavior, the social emotional learning survey, family survey, these types of data that aren't outcome data that are measured typically using the accountability and assessment process. What existing work should we continue, modify, or scrap? So all of that stuff in the major improvement strategies. What should we continue doing, and what should we add, and what should we kind of take away? Because obviously we have a finite amount of resources, and how do we do that? And what's the best way to proceed? And then lastly, what new work must we engage in? So those were 4 questions we had with the learning services coordinator. These are folks like content coordinators who are content specialists, directors, folks working at the central office that really interface with schools and do a lot of the work in learning services. Here's what they said, and I've just summarized this for you. Here's what we heard. The majority of folks, when they responded to this question about pre-pandemic data and efforts, say we should look at both. We can't ignore what's happened in the pandemic, but we also need to be cognizant of the data that and the issues we had beforehand, because likely we weren't able to solve them in the pandemic. That issue around literacy is still likely there while we're moving through the pandemic. But there are some data that said literacy actually wasn't as necessarily showing less growth than math now. So they thought that the pandemic and the pre-pandemic data were important. They also said, and I apologize, this is really dense, but I'll summarize it for you, that we should really be looking at non-academic data as well as academic data when we're thinking about this plan. And a question arose is, when you look at the Elevate plan, the district's strategic plan, one of the major pushes in there is social emotional learning for students. That's what that SEL is. So does it make sense to put that in the district academic plan? Or does it make sense to develop a separate plan around how do we help support students moving out of this pandemic and help them with their sense of belonging and their competencies and how they deal with these things? Because one of the issues we face, if you throw everything under the sun in the district UIP, things get lost. It becomes this bloated mess. So would it make sense to focus on the academic things in the UIP and then have a separate SEL plan, or does it make sense to have them together? So that was a question that I'd be love to hear any feedback that you might have, and I'll share where we're going toward the end. In terms of the third question, here were what people responded with. They really they wanted to continue with the literacy work. The GVC stands for Guaranteed and Viable Curriculum. Teacher pedagogy is how they instruct. Formative practices, engagement with social emotional learning, and a focus at the high school level because of all that data we saw with PSAT and SAT and things trending negatively. Also, there was a question that was asked here is, is there a way to craft a major improvement strategy that's not just based solely on literacy, that can encompass multiple content areas, math being one of them, based on what we saw with our math data during the pandemic? So again, that was a question that arose. And finally, what new work must we engage in? Well, you'll see the themes that arose there were math, cross-content literacy, because we really weren't able to start that work because of the pandemic, engagement, equity, and then also leveraging as one of the positive things that came out of the pandemic, if we want to look at it that way, is a lot of the investment in technology and platforms for teachers and students. And how do we leverage those resources in an in-person setting, because they can be leveraged that way. And I don't know if you are aware, the board, I believe, took action at their last board meeting talking about us going to a one-to-one district with district supported devices for all students. So knowing that that's going to be an initiative, how do we leverage those things that we really, dove into this year in some cases moving forward? So those were the feedback we got from learning services staff. And we then had some conversations, and this is really where, and I don't know if Stephanie Audet was able to make the meeting where this was discussed with elementary principals. This led us to thinking about 3 general improvement strategies that are in very draft format still at this point. And we've gotten good feedback from principals that they like these ideas as well. And some of the other specific work, we delved a little bit into what this might look like. But the first is to accelerate learning for students and adults through increased intentional collaboration and formative practices. One of the things we heard from staff was and students, they really missed the ability to collaborate and interact, and that affected how things worked. It's always so much easier to bounce ideas off other students and or other staff members. That was the idea behind collaboration. Formative practices are instructional practices. We've provided a lot of professional development to our elementary staff and middle school staff around, and we want to build on those more, because those are useful across any content area, not just literacy and math. And there will be some targeted things that we look at in terms of literacy and math. But this idea of how do we do this for all content areas and for students and adults. Then a second was to keep that similar strategy we had before, because we can't lose sight of those impacted groups, particularly students with individual education plans, free and reduced lunch students and ELLs. And then lastly, and this would be more of the major improvement strategy if we choose to go with a social emotional learning focus in the UIP, is to establish a supportive environment where each student is comfortable and confident engaging in learning. So having that strong classroom and school environment where students feel like they can work and engage. And here's where we'd see a lot of inclusion of data along our social emotional learning survey and other measures that schools are looking at: attendance, behavior, engagement, things of that nature. So these were the 3 general draft strategies we have at this point. And obviously I'd be interested in any feedback you have about those as well. So I've kind of led you through the data that we've seen, the work we did on our prior UIP, and the thinking around learning services, and to an extent principals, especially with this latter part, about what we think would be good areas to focus moving forward for the 21-22 UIP and the 22-23 UIP as well. So at this point, I really just want to open it to the questions and discussion for how do you see that flowing? And then those 2 questions we broached at the beginning that are on the Jamboard. And I don't know if it makes sense for me to give us take a quick 5-minute break or something so people can get up, stretch a little bit. I know I've been talking at you a while. I apologize for that. I just wanted to be thorough and hopefully clear. Aaron and Jack, since this is your meeting, are you comfortable with that idea of taking a quick break for people to stretch and then come back with questions?
Yeah, I think that's fine. Why don't we regroup at 8:17?
Okay. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing at this point. This is really the end of the presentation, and I can always share again if you want me to highlight something. Okay, 8:17.
All right, we're back, Dave.
I'm surprised I didn't scare them all away.
So I'm going to speak quickly to some logistics around the UIP work. As Dave mentioned, the timeline this year changed on us and accelerated from our typical UIP subcommittee work year. The questions that are on the Jamboard, we can certainly raise those for Dave as a group tonight. The intention is that we will take those Jamboard questions and the curiosities on page 2 and work those into that simplification focus on process as part of the UIP subcommittee work this year. And what that means is that we will draft the workflow model and the memo of understanding with Jamie and Lori. And because of the urgent timeline, Aaron and I will work to make that happen very soon because we don't want to hold Dave up. But again, the intention is to really clarify that simplification effort alongside what the UIP work looks like this year. So that's a lot of words to say. If there's something on that Jamboard that's really burning for tonight, then please raise it with Dave. Otherwise, we will work to incorporate those into the subcommittee effort later in the year.
So this Jamboard is for process, and I know the other question that Dave presented was about content to learn more, or I guess my question is a little twofold. If that's what you want us to talk about, or if you want us to talk about the questions that Dave posed that were a part of that UIP discussion. So I just want to make sure I understand where we're headed here.
I'm going to say we have 10 minutes left tonight and really nothing's off limits, but the intent of the Jamboard is for future focus. But if it is burning or you want to address anything that Dave brought up tonight, please do that.
I also might add, I've been taking rather extensive notes throughout the conversation and have been classifying questions as I've heard them into both of those categories. So the Jamboard is not the sole collection of our conversation this evening.
Thank you for doing that, Aaron.
I'm just gonna keep going then. So I guess my question is really to Dave, to the questions you posed that came up from those strategies, and I think the group, the principals, perhaps learning services around lots of those questions. It's interesting that their responses weren't that different from my own, which is, yes, we have to pay attention to all those things, which is not really all that useful, I understand. I will say this, particularly around this academics versus SEL question, that I believe it will be critical, I think, moving forward, as this gets crafted and drafted, that it's a little bit of a, I'm sure, a philosophical question, can you actually separate the two? Right? And that if students aren't feeling connected relationships and have belonging, and there's fairness and equity, can they really do well academically? Some can, others cannot. Usually those things are quite interconnected. And so how that gets posed in a UIP, I think it's in some of those strategies, obviously, that have been mentioned, but those are the things that come up for me. And how to balance it so that some SEL is showing up and it's not solely academic within the UIP. So I'm certain that is not new news, but that's what it raised for me. I do appreciate people asking the question around elevate strategies, because I know I feel like that all came with all this really interesting, strong work around strategies and methods and kind of process, all of those things, as well as funding, and then everything kind of dropped out because of COVID, and some of those monies had to get moved around, right? All of those things happened. So I am curious around the connection to budget and finances around, and those elevate strategies pre-COVID, and then how you elevate those things particularly needed post-COVID. Those are the things that showed up for me.
Dave, I had a question. Are those the 3 specific things that you listed? Are those just generally what came down to strategies, or I forget how you call them exactly, or were they going to have more specific plans that you could measure?
Yeah, those are the general, very high level, 10,000 feet buckets that then all the more specific work fits into. Yes, that's then
Okay.
what happens is each of those major improvement strategies may have 10 to 12 action steps that we're going to do and then monitor throughout the life of the plan or a portion of the life of the plan to then improve those outcomes in the areas that we've identified.
Okay. Thank you.
Dave, is there specific feedback you're looking for from this group tonight?
Knowing that we're a little short on time, what I guess the main point of feedback that would be beneficial for me to take back would be, does the data and what we did before and what we're thinking about doing coming up, does that make sense? Is that logical? Does that flow well? Or are we off base somewhere in terms of where we want to focus our strategies based on the data and where we've been?
The only thing I could see is that the collaboration piece, if you're talking about students collaborating as well, right? Is that if we come back and we can't do, they can't get close and they can't, because as far as like sitting them in groups and using the Kagan strategies, and if we can't use those, because that's what we're missing right now, and it does affect them. And so I mean, that's huge. It's really hurting them. So if we come back and we can hit the ground running, then that would be great. But working around those has been really difficult. So I don't know, some great ideas around how to collaborate if we can't actually get together. So just to keep that in mind.
Lisa and I are chatty tonight. I do have a question around that. I mean, I think I can make some assumptions about that big mass drop off, right? But I think it's going to have to, whatever the dig is, to mine that information and that data. It makes sense to me to keep going with the literacy strategies as you all are talking about it and as others have chimed in. I do think, it's going to be hard not to wonder about that a bit. I don't know what that means in creating a strategy, but right, I think it can't totally be ignored, considering can't be totally ignored, right? So that's, I think, just a question I have.
Anyone else want to offer some feedback? Then Dave, do you have a sense of the meeting frequency or the timeline over the summer that you would like to see from the DAC members? Or do you want to visit about that another time?
I think we probably want to visit about that another time, knowing obviously we're short on time. I'm happy to connect with you about what that, with some ideas and what there's there. The other thing I think we need to be cognizant of is people are tired. And there will be, I don't want to be too stressful in terms of how much we meet over the summer, but obviously I'm very, I'd be interested in doing that if that works for people, because knowing that the time frame is October, And really, we need to have something really by October 1st so we can get it to the board prior to that meeting and have us, so I won't bore you with that, but I think it's probably left for a later date to discuss in the near future.
Okay, we have some moving parts as well. We have some members that are leaving, and we have some members with different subcommittee priority choices. So we owe you that list. We'll get that to you and the board as well. But it felt logical that we would have maybe 1 or 2 meetings over the summer so that you're not waiting on us as well. So we'll follow up and get that out to the rest of the committee. As we wind down, Aaron, I'll give you an opportunity as well. But I just want to say thank you to the whole group this year. It has been quite a challenge. I think Zoom fatigue is a thing. I think we might hear that it hits the Webster Dictionary as a new word next year. And also, I think it added some flexibility for more people to be able to attend. So I think it was sort of bittersweet. We really appreciate, Aaron and I, your attendance this year. We did have a much more aggressive meeting schedule that was intentional. We had a lot to cover this year. We still have big plans over the summer and into next year structurally to make this an even better organization for the district and the board. So we look forward to those of you coming back and the new members that we hopefully are recruiting from the Leadership Academy and some other sources. But I definitely want to hear you, or I want you to hear us thank you for your time and involvement this year. Aaron, do you want to add anything?
Hopefully I was able to express my my appreciation for this group and for the members and sort of stepping up in this time. And again, recognizing, I'm going to use Laura's expression, it takes a special kind of person to want to do this in their off time, and just really appreciate all the time and effort and thinking that folks have put into this. So thank you.
All right, well, with that, we will adjourn. It's great to see everybody. There will be plenty of communications coming out over the summer. Oh, Jamie and Lori, I can't let the meeting go. Thank you so much for attending. You have full schedules, and you made nearly every meeting this year. That's saying a lot, and we really find value in your attendance and your feedback. So thank you for that as well. You'll hear some updates from us very soon. But want to get you on your way in the evening. So meeting adjourned.
Happy 2021 school year, everybody.
Thanks
Have
for
a
your
good summer.
leadership, Aaron and Jack.
Thanks, Aaron and Jack.
Thank you,
Thanks for
Aaron
all
and
you
Jack.
did. We appreciate you.
Yep.